The dress she held felt like a promise. Her heart was pounding, hopeful, certain, ready. She could almost taste the vows about to be spoken. And then, the church doors swung open, revealing a woman she had never seen before. She carried a toddler whose tiny hand clutched the hem of his dress. All eyes turned. Her world stopped. That was the moment her wedding, the life she thought she had planned, began to unravel. But how had it come to this? Because just hours before, she believed she was marrying the man of her dreams. She had no idea what truth was walking down the aisle. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Her name was Sarah, 29 years old. A schoolteacher with a quiet grace, the kind of woman who believed in handwritten letters, in keeping promises, in forever. People in her small town spoke of her kindness before they spoke of her beauty, and yet she had both. Then there was David. 32, the man who could light up any room he walked into. Respected in the community, steady job, active in the church. To those who knew him, or thought they did, he was the very definition of a good man. They met at a charity event, of all places. A spilled cup of coffee, an apologetic smile, and within weeks they were inseparable. Sarah said it was fate. David said it was meant to be. Friends whispered, they just fit. And in a town where everyone knows everyone, the news of their engagement was more than a story, it was an event. They seemed perfect together. Sunday mornings spent at church, weekday evenings walking hand in hand down Main Street, talking about dreams they hadn't yet lived. Sarah spoke often of the family they would build, the life they would create. Her friends would smile when she talked because her happiness was contagious. The wedding was set to be a community celebration. Everyone from her childhood neighbors to David's co-workers would be there. It felt like the kind of love story people told their children, the kind of love that made the world seem a little less complicated. But not everyone shared that feeling. There were a few, just a few, who kept their opinions to themselves. They knew things that never found their way into conversations over coffee or after Sunday service. And if Sarah had asked the right questions, perhaps they would have spoken. But she didn't. And they didn't. For Sarah, the stakes were higher than just a wedding day. This was her future. Her chance to be a wife, a mother, to live the life she'd dreamed of since she was a little girl playing dress-up in her grandmother's attic. For David, it was about more than vows. It was about standing in front of his family, his friends, and showing the world he had built something worth admiring. And for the town, this wedding was more than an invitation on the fridge. It was a symbol of hope. In a place where gossip could travel faster than a summer storm, this was one story everyone seemed happy to tell. At least for now. Because while Sarah was busy planning flowers and music, someone else was quietly preparing for the moment that would change everything. It began quietly, almost too quietly to notice. One afternoon, as Sarah sat with her closest friend, Emily, finalizing seating charts for the reception, Emily's tone shifted. She hesitated, choosing her words with care. Sarah, are you sure you know everything about David? Sarah laughed softly, thinking it was just nerves or the usual pre-wedding jitters friends sometimes project. But Emily didn't smile. He's had a complicated past, she said finally. Sarah pressed for details, but Emily shook her head, muttering that it wasn't her place. The words lingered, hanging in Sarah's mind like a shadow she couldn't place. Complicated past. What did that mean? She told herself she trusted David. He had never given her a reason not to. Still, later that night, lying in bed, she found herself replaying Emily's expression, the way her eyes had searched Sarah's face as if hoping she'd understand without needing to be told. 2 days later, the doubt that had been a whisper became something harder to ignore. Sarah's phone buzzed while she was at the florist, confirming centerpieces. A text from an unknown number lit up her screen. Just 5 words, ask him about May 14th. She stared at it, confused. No explanation, no name, just the date. She typed back, who is this? But there was no reply. She tried to shake it off. After all, wedding week was stressful enough without strange messages from strangers. She told herself it could be a prank, maybe even a jealous ex trying to ruin her happiness. But later, when she saw David that evening, she caught herself watching him more closely. Did he seem different? Was there something in his voice, his eyes? She hated herself for thinking it, but she didn't ask about May 14th. Not yet. Instead, she tucked the thought away, for now. The next morning, Sarah mentioned the message to her maid of honor, Kelly. Kelly frowned but quickly changed the subject almost too quickly. That subtle deflection made Sarah uneasy, but again she pushed the feeling down. She told herself she was being dramatic, overthinking things because of the chaos of wedding week. But curiosity has a way of sitting in the back of your mind, waiting for the right moment to demand answers. In quiet moments, brushing her hair before bed, stirring sugar into her morning coffee, those words returned. Ask him about May 14th. She didn't know it yet, but May 14th was the day everything began to unravel. A day that, if she had known the truth behind it, might have stopped the wedding before it ever began. But that truth was still in the shadows, and the shadows were only just starting to move. In the days that followed, Sarah began to notice things she had never noticed before. At first they seemed small, too small to mean anything on their own. David would step outside to take certain phone calls, lowering his voice just enough that she couldn't catch a word. Sometimes, when she walked into the room, he would quickly slip his phone into his pocket, smiling like nothing had happened. She told herself it was work. After all, he was busy and not every conversation needed to be shared. But deep down something felt different. It wasn't the calls themselves but the way he looked afterward, slightly tense as though he'd been reminded of something he didn't want to face. The more she told herself to ignore it, the harder it became. And when you start noticing small changes, it's only a matter of time before you see the bigger ones. One afternoon, while running errands, Sarah suggested they take a shortcut through the east side of town. David hesitated, then gave a quick, firm, "No, let's go the other way." He claimed traffic was worse there, but Sarah had driven that route herself. She knew it wasn't. His tone had been final, almost sharp, and it left her wondering what he didn't want her to see. Over the next few days she began to notice a pattern. He never drove near that part of town, never even mentioned it. And yet, whenever they passed within a few blocks, his posture would stiffen, his hands tightening slightly on the steering wheel. Sarah wanted to ask why, but something in her told her she wasn't ready for the answer. Sometimes silence feels safer, until it isn't. Then there was the cafe. A quiet little place Sarah often stopped at after work for tea. On a cool Thursday afternoon she pushed open the door and found it nearly empty, except for one woman seated by the window. The woman's eyes locked on her immediately, holding her gaze just a little too long. Sarah offered a polite smile, but the woman didn't smile back. Instead, she just kept looking as if she knew something Sarah didn't. Sarah told herself it was nothing, just a stranger's curiosity. But when she glanced back on her way out, the woman was still watching. What Sarah didn't realize was that this woman had been in David's life far longer than she had. And in just a few short days she would step out of the shadows, carrying the one thing Sarah could never have prepared for. The night before the wedding should have been perfect. And to anyone looking in from the outside it was. The rehearsal dinner was warm and full of laughter, the soft clinking of glasses, the low hum of conversation, the glow of candles reflecting off smiling faces. Sarah moved through the room like someone in a dream, hugging relatives she hadn't seen in years, listening to toasts filled with stories from childhood. David was at her side, his hand resting gently at her back, playing the role of the groom everyone adored. But beneath the surface, Sarah still carried a quiet unease, tiny cracks in her trust she had spent the past few days trying to ignore. She told herself she was overthinking things, that tomorrow would be the happiest day of her life. Still, when David suddenly excused himself and stepped outside for a phone call, she noticed. And she wasn't the only one. From where she sat, Sarah could see him through the window. He stood just beyond the light, his face turned away, shoulders slightly hunched as he spoke into the phone. It was the way he held himself, tense, contained, that caught her attention. Every few seconds he would glance around as though making sure no one could hear. The conversation was short but not short enough to be casual. And then, she saw it. His expression shifted, from irritation to something almost pleading. Her maid of honor, Kelly, had slipped out to take a breath of fresh air and was close enough to catch a few words. When she returned to the table, her face was pale. She leaned toward Sarah, her voice low, her eyes fixed on her plate. "I heard him say, 'I'll fix this after tomorrow.'" That was all. But for Sarah, those words felt like the first cold drop before a storm. Kelly didn't elaborate and Sarah didn't press her, not in that moment. They returned to the chatter of the table, the laughter of family members, the speeches filled with well wishes for the future. But Sarah's mind wasn't there anymore. She kept glancing toward the window, half expecting David to be standing there still. The words replayed in her head, each time carrying more weight. "I'll fix this after tomorrow." Fix what? And why after tomorrow? She smiled when people raised glasses to her, thanked them for their blessings and accepted hugs. But inside, a restlessness had taken hold. The night went on, the guests slowly left, and Sarah was left with her thoughts. She would fall asleep that night believing that whatever David meant could wait. But she had no idea that, after tomorrow, would never come in the way she imagined. The morning of her wedding began in quiet light. Sunlight slipped through the curtains, casting warm gold over the room where Sarah slept. For a moment she lay still, wrapped in that half-dream state where nothing yet feels real. Then her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She reached for it, expecting a message from Kelly or a last-minute reminder from the florist. Instead, she saw an unfamiliar number. The message was simple. "It's not too late to ask the truth." She stared at the screen, her breath caught somewhere between confusion and fear. Her first instinct was to delete it, erase the doubt before it could take root. But she didn't. She set the phone down, forcing her mind to focus on the day ahead. She told herself she knew David. She told herself nothing could ruin this day. But the words of that message lingered, unshakable, in the back of her mind. Her morning unfolded in the rhythm of tradition, makeup brushes sweeping across her skin, the scent of hairspray hanging in the air, the weight of silk settling over her shoulders as the dress was zipped into place. Friends laughed and told her how beautiful she looked. Mothers exchanged knowing glances, cameras clicked in the corners of the room. On the surface, Sarah was the image of calm. She smiled for the photos, accepted every compliment, thanked everyone who fussed over her. Inside, though, a quiet voice kept asking questions she didn't want to answer. What did they mean by "ask the truth"? And why today? She reminded herself that in a few short hours, she would be standing beside David, vowing to spend her life with him. She clung to that image because it felt safer than the possibility that the message might mean more than she dared to believe. Outside, the day seemed perfect. Clear skies, a gentle breeze, the sound of birds drifting in through the open window. The world gave no hint that anything was wrong. But the audience should remember this. In just a few hours, a stranger would walk through the church doors, carrying something that would unravel everything Sarah thought she knew. Every smile that morning, every laugh, every whispered blessing, it was all moving toward that single moment. A moment that would shatter the celebration into something else entirely. If Sarah had known then what she would know before the day was over, perhaps she would have asked the truth when she had the chance. But she didn't. She stepped into the waiting car, veil gently swaying with the movement, unaware that each mile was taking her closer to the end of the life she thought she was beginning. The church was quiet in that sacred, expectant way only a wedding can create. Light poured in through tall stained-glass windows, scattering color across the aisle. The music swelled softly, the air thick with the scent of flowers, the murmur of guests fading into stillness. Sarah stood at the back, arm in arm with her father, her heart beating so loudly she swore the people in the front row could hear it. As she took the first step down the aisle, every face turned toward her, smiling, some with tears already forming. David was there at the altar, straight-backed, eyes fixed on her. For a brief moment, all her doubts slipped away. She could almost believe this was the day she had dreamed of. Step by step, she drew closer to him, closer to the vows that would bind them together. No one in that room knew those vows would never be spoken. They reached the final lines of the ceremony. The minister smiled, lifting his gaze over the congregation. Guests rose to their feet, the rustle of fabric and the quiet shifting of shoes echoing in the vaulted space. Sarah and David turned slightly to face them, the traditional blessing moments away. And then, the sound of hinges broke through the silence. The heavy church doors creaked open, slow enough that it felt intentional. Every head turned. A figure appeared in the doorway, a woman Sarah had never seen before. She was young, perhaps only a few years older than Sarah, and in her arms she held a small child. A boy no older than 2, his round eyes wide as they scanned the unfamiliar room. His tiny fingers clutched the edge of her dress. The woman's steps were steady, deliberate, each one pulling the air tighter in the room. Gasps broke the stillness. A murmur rippled through the guests, sharp enough that Sarah felt it in her chest. She froze, her eyes darting from the woman to David. His face had gone pale, so pale it seemed all the blood had drained from it in an instant. The woman stopped halfway down the aisle, her gaze locked on David. And then, in a voice that carried clearly over every pew, she said, "David, your son should see his father get married." The words seemed to echo, bouncing off the stone walls, heavy and unshakable. For Sarah, time fractured. The scent of flowers was suddenly too sweet, the music too loud, her veil too heavy on her head. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She only watched David, waiting for him to deny it. Waiting for him to say it wasn't true. But in the silence that followed, she realized he wasn't going to. The air inside the church shifted instantly. It was no longer the gentle, expectant stillness of a wedding, it was something sharper, fractured. Whispers rose like wind through tall grass, moving from pew to pew as guests leaned toward one another, eyes wide, voices low but urgent. Sarah could hear fragments, her name, David's name, the word son repeated over and over. Her father's hand tightened slightly on her arm, but she hardly noticed. Her eyes were fixed on David. His jaw was tense, his shoulders rigid, and yet there was something else. His skin had gone pale, almost gray, as if all the color had been drained away in a single breath. The woman in the aisle stood unmoving, the boy in her arms shifting restlessly, unaware of the storm he had just stepped into. For Sarah, it was as if the world had narrowed to just three people: herself, David, and the stranger holding a truth. The murmurs grew louder, overlapping into a dull roar of speculation. Some guests stared openly, others turned their eyes away as if to give Sarah privacy she didn't have. She felt heat rise to her face, but her voice came out cold, steady, and clear. "Is it true?" Her question cut through the noise like glass breaking. All eyes turned to David. He opened his mouth but no words came. His gaze shifted to the floor, then to the woman, then back to Sarah, as if searching for an escape that wasn't there. She asked again, sharper this time, "David, is it true?" He hesitated, his lips parting slightly, but again there was only silence. A silence that pressed in on her, that seemed to weigh more than any answer could. And in that silence, Sarah understood. Sometimes the absence of denial is its own confession. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She searched his face for something, remorse, explanation, anything that might soften the blow, but found nothing that could undo the moment. The minister shifted uncomfortably at the altar, unsure whether to speak or stand back. The guests waited, caught in the awkward, painful suspension between a celebration and a collapse. And still David said nothing. His eyes seemed to plead with her, but his mouth stayed closed. Sarah's breath caught, a sharp ache blooming in her chest. She thought of the late-night conversations, the promises whispered under stars, the life they had spoken about as if it were certain. And now, in front of everyone they loved, it all hung in the balance, broken though the pieces had not yet hit the floor. The woman in the aisle took a slow step forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor, each sound echoing in the silence David had left behind. She shifted the boy in her arms, her voice steady but threaded with hurt. "We were together until last year," she said, her gaze locked on David, not Sarah. "And you promised to be there for him." A ripple ran through the crowd, sharp intakes of breath, quiet gasps, the rustle of bodies turning to catch every word. Sarah felt the words land heavy inside her, but her mind refused to let them settle. Until last year. That wasn't some distant history, it was barely yesterday. The woman's free hand reached into her bag, pulling out a phone. She tapped the screen and held it up. "You told me you'd never walk away." Her thumb slid across the screen. Messages, dozens of them, appeared in bold text. Sarah caught flashes of David's name, words of affection, plans that stretched into months when he'd already been courting her. Then the photos, David holding the boy as an infant, smiling like a proud father. Selfies of him and the woman at restaurants Sarah had thought were their special places. Time-stamped dates that lined up with weekends Sarah believed he was working late. The proof was no longer an accusation. It was fact, laid bare in front of everyone. Inside, Sarah's thoughts spun wildly. How long had this been going on? How many times had I asked if something was wrong and he smiled like nothing was out of place? How could he stand here, look me in the eyes, and let me walk into this day believing I was his only choice? She felt the humiliation rise like a wave, washing over her in front of family, friends, neighbors, people who would carry this moment back into the small town like embers that would never die out. Her cheeks burned, not from the heat of the church, but from the sting of realizing she had been building her future on a lie everyone could now see. David took a half step forward as if to speak, but the woman's voice cut through again. "I didn't come here to ruin this," she said softly, eyes still on him. "I came because he deserves to know who his father is, and because you don't get to pretend he doesn't exist." The boy looked up at David, innocent and unaware, while Sarah's chest tightened at the sight. It wasn't just betrayal, it was the death of the man she thought she knew. But even now she could sense there was more. This wasn't the full story. This wasn't the deepest cut. And as she stood there, fighting to breathe, one thought burned in her mind. If this is only the beginning, what could possibly be worse? Long before the church doors opened, before the dress and the flowers and the quiet hum of anticipation, there had been another story running alongside Sarah's. A story she had never been told. The truth stretched back nearly 2 years. Two separate timelines moving in parallel, destined to collide. In one, Sarah met David on a breezy autumn afternoon, his laugh easy, his eyes warm. In the other, somewhere else in the same small town, another woman was already calling him her partner, her future, her safe place. David had been living in both worlds, his footsteps carefully placed so neither side saw the other. But lives are not neat lines on paper. They overlap. They blur. In the weeks Sarah thought David was away on work trips, he was holding the other woman's hand at prenatal checkups. On the night Sarah pictured him eating takeout in his apartment, he was learning the rhythm of midnight feedings. He'd tell Sarah he missed her while texting the mother of his child about buying diapers. The breakup he had spoken of so casually, when he admitted early on that he'd had a past relationship, wasn't a clean ending at all. It was a tangled knot of promises made to two people, promises he had no plan of keeping. And when Sarah thought back to May 14th, the date whispered in that anonymous text, it hit her. That was the day his son was born. The flashback stretched further, each memory cutting deeper. She remembered a dinner party where David had excused himself to take a call outside. He'd returned smiling, but his hands had trembled as he poured the wine. She remembered how he always avoided a certain street in town, even if it meant adding 10 minutes to the drive. And now those decisions were no longer quirks, they were signs. The truth was a mosaic and the pieces had been there all along. In the present, whispers moved through the pews like wind through dry leaves. People who had been smiling minutes ago now leaned toward each other, trading quiet confessions. A groomsman shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Sarah's eyes. And then one of her closest friends, someone she had trusted with her deepest fears, looked at the floor and whispered almost too low to hear, I didn't want to say anything. I thought maybe it was over. I didn't want to ruin this for you. That single sentence pierced her more sharply than any proof the other woman could hold. Because now Sarah realized, some people had known. Some had suspected. And silence had been their choice. In that moment she understood that betrayal doesn't always come only from the one who lies. Sometimes it comes from the ones who stay quiet, who watch you walk toward the edge without warning you. And as she stood there in her wedding dress, the weight of both timelines pressing down on her, one question formed in her mind. If they were willing to hide this, what else had they kept from me? The silence inside the church shattered when Sarah turned on her heel, the train of her dress sweeping across the aisle like a sudden gust of wind. She didn't look at David, didn't look at the woman, didn't look at the guest who had just watched her heart split open. The heavy wooden doors slammed behind her, and the noise seemed to echo down the quiet street outside. Footsteps followed, her mother, her maid of honor, a few family members who didn't know whether to comfort her or shield her from what was coming next. The summer air hit her like a wall, hot and unrelenting, but the heat in her chest was worse. She spun around just as David stepped through the doorway, his face pale, his tie loosened as if the perfect groom had been peeled away in seconds. Sarah, please, he began, but she cut him off, her voice sharp, ragged. How long, she demanded. How long have you been lying to me? How long have you been playing both of us? David's hands went up in a useless gesture of surrender. It's over, he said quickly, almost desperately. It's in the past. I ended it before we got serious. I was trying to do the right thing. But the words rang hollow, and before Sarah could answer, the woman emerged from the church steps, the boy still balanced on her hip. Her voice was calm, almost too calm. In the past, she said. You sent me money last week. The statement hung in the air like a blade. Sarah's eyes darted from David to the woman, searching his face for some sign, guilt, anger, regret. But what she saw was something worse, hesitation. That single pause told her more than any speech could. He had been supporting the child, yes, but he hadn't told her. And in that moment the situation tilted. This wasn't a neat story of a man abandoning his child or a man caught in a single mistake. This was something murkier. Messier. David's voice cracked as he tried to explain. I didn't want to hurt you. I was trying to protect you from all of this. I couldn't just walk away from him. He's my son. The words were heavy, almost noble on the surface, but underneath them lay the truth. He had been making decisions for both of their lives without giving Sarah a choice. Her mind reeled. The betrayal wasn't just about another woman, it was about the years of stolen decisions, the moments he had rewritten without her knowing, the moral high ground he had tried to stand on while she walked blindly beside him. The church bells in the distance began to ring for the wedding that would not happen, not today and maybe not ever. And as Sarah stood on the church steps, surrounded by family, strangers, and the man she thought she knew, she realized this confrontation wasn't about who was telling the truth. It was about whether there was any truth left at all. The noise outside faded into a dull hum as Sarah closed the heavy door of the small side room. The walls pressed in around her, pale and bare except for a mirror leaning slightly against one corner. The air was still, the kind of stillness that makes you hear your own heartbeat. Somewhere far off, the muffled swell of a piano began to play, soft, slow, the kind of melody meant for walking down an aisle, but now it underscored something else entirely. Her reflection stared back at her. The perfect dress, the careful hair, the eyes she barely recognized. Her lipstick was unbroken, her veil still pinned, but beneath the surface, everything had already unraveled. She sank into the small wooden chair against the wall, her fingers clutching the fabric at her knees as if holding it tighter might stop the ground from giving way. The shame crept in first, flashes of faces from the church pews, guests who had flown in, friends who had toasted to her future, family who had called him the one. How would they look at her now? Would they pity her? Whisper about her? Part of her wanted to smooth the veil, stand up straight and walk back out there. Pretend. Make it through the day and sort the wreckage later in private. That way no one would see her break. That way she could leave with her dignity intact. But dignity, she realized, was not the same as truth. And the truth was sitting heavy in her chest, pressing down until it was hard to breathe. She thought of the woman's voice, steady, certain. "You sent me money last week." She thought of the hesitation in David's eyes, the way he'd said "I didn't want to hurt you," as though the lie itself had been a gift. She thought of the child, unaware of the chaos he'd just walked into, but carrying a truth she hadn't been given. Her mind cut through the noise with one clear thought: if he could lie about a child, he could lie about anything. And suddenly all the questions she hadn't asked rose like ghosts. Where had he really been on those late nights? Who had he called when he stepped outside during dinner parties? What other pieces of her life had been decided without her? Her hands loosened on the dress. She sat still for a moment longer, the piano outside stretching each note like a thread ready to snap. Then quietly she stood. The veil slid down her shoulders, landing on the chair behind her. One deep breath, then another. And when she opened the door, her face was set, not for a wedding march but for something else entirely. Something that would change every person waiting for her in that church. The church doors opened once more, but this time there was no music, no smile, no cue for the guests to rise. Sarah stepped into the aisle alone, the light from the stained glass windows spilling across her dress like fractured colors. Every head turned toward her, expecting perhaps a late entrance, a delay, a bride still ready to walk toward her future. But her steps were slow, deliberate, more like someone walking away from a burning building than toward a celebration. Her voice carried in the stillness, steady but edged with the weight of what had just happened. "There will be no wedding today," she said. The words cut through the air, clean and irreversible. A ripple of shock spread through the pews, gasps, muffled whispers, the kind of stunned silence that feels like the world holding its breath. She didn't explain. She didn't owe them that. Her eyes didn't search for David. She knew where he stood, frozen halfway down the aisle, hands slack at his sides, his perfect day collapsing in front of everyone. Instead, Sarah looked straight ahead, past the flowers, past the altar, past the expectations that had been built for months, maybe years. And then she turned toward the doors. The maid of honor moved quickly to her side, slipping an arm around her, not to guide her but to walk with her. Together they passed through the stunned congregation, the sound of their footsteps louder than the whispers that followed. Outside, the summer light was bright, almost blinding, but Sarah didn't flinch. She held her head high, the choice made, the path forward unknown but finally her own. From the doorway, the woman with the toddler watched them leave. She didn't speak, didn't gloat, didn't try to stop her. Instead, their eyes met for a brief moment, two women bound in very different ways by the same man's choices. And in that moment there was no rivalry, no hatred, only a strange, unspoken respect. A recognition that both of them had been living in someone else's story, and both had just stepped out of it. Sarah never married David. There was no quiet reconciliation, no secret ceremony months later. The dress went back into its box, the ring into a drawer she no longer opened. In the weeks that followed, life in their small town moved on, or at least it pretended to. People still saw David at the grocery store, still nodded politely, but the whispers always followed a step behind. David sees his son occasionally. He shows up for birthdays, sometimes for holidays, but never stays too long. And while the child grows, learning new words, outgrowing shoes, there's a shadow over those moments, a weight that only the adults can feel. Because everyone who stood in that church that day remembers the gasp, the silence, the fracture in the air that couldn't be mended. The truth of that moment still lingers, like a crack in stained glass, visible to anyone who dares to look closely. Sometimes the truth doesn't set you free. Sometimes, it shatters you first, splinters everything you thought was solid, scatters the pieces across a floor you may never be able to walk on without feeling the sharp edges. But in the breaking there is also clarity. And Sarah chose to live with that clarity, even if it meant walking away from everything she thought she wanted. So I'll leave you with this. If you were Sarah standing in that aisle, dress heavy on your shoulders, every eye on you, would you have ended it there? Or would you have tried to make it work, to salvage the pieces? If this story gripped you, stay with us. Like, subscribe, and join us every week as we share true stories that will leave you speechless. Stories you won't be able to stop thinking about long after the final words fade.